Welcome to another episode of Brute Facts. Tonight I have Dr. Josh Rasmussen. I am excited for this episode. He is an associate professor at Azusa Pacific University, has a PhD from Notre Dame, and has written quite a few books and quite a few articles, many that I have benefited tremendously from myself. So hang around and he'll be on shortly. Welcome, Dr. Josh. How are you doing?
I'm wonderful. I think I just got eaten by a lion. That was a cool intro.
I really appreciate that. I actually did that myself.
That's awesome.
It took, well, man, it is so hard to play with the video editing. It's it makes you lose hair. So
Brings the hair down.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was awesome, though. I love that. Cool. Good job.
I appreciate that. So is it pronounced Azusa?
Azusa Pacific University.
Okay.
Yeah.
I thought so. And Notre Dame, did you get to work with Alvin Plantinga?
Yes. So Plantinga was he was my research sponsor during a postdoc position, and then before that, I worked with Peter Van Wagen. He was my dissertation advisor.
Wow.
So, yeah. Peter was really awesome. He helped me to appreciate the value of making things clear and defining all of your terms. So I love that about him. Yeah.
Yeah. Van Inwagen, he's one of those that if you didn't know, you wouldn't know if he was a theist or not. He kind of takes different positions that typically other philosophers of religion that are theists don't take. So I bet that was interesting.
He wasn't a theist earlier in his career, and he shifted over. I think in his testimony, I remember reading that there was sort of this duck rabbit experience where he could sort of see the universe as self-sufficient, but then he could also see it as dependent, and he was kind of flickering between the views. But then, so he became a theist later in his career.
Okay, well, that makes a lot more sense. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about yourself. Were you raised a Christian? How did that all work with you?
I'm a philosopher. That's one thing about me. I also like to tell people that I'm a conscious being. I have that going for me as well. But yeah, so my family, my parents raised me in the Christian tradition. And as we were talking before the show, I had sort of a worldview falling apart, and you were describing this for your own self, where your worldview sort of fell apart and you became agnostic for a bit there. And I had that same experience. And I think this is actually a very common experience where you kind of go from a worldview of your community or maybe your family or whatever, and then you realize that not everybody has that worldview. And so you have to kind of figure out, okay, well, I can't just borrow my worldview from others. So let me think about this. And that sort of led me into philosophy and, to kind of own my worldview and build my own understanding of reality.
And this was in high school, right?
Yeah, this was late high school.
Right.
Yeah.
So did you actually get into philosophy in high school, or was that just kind of a natural?
Well, it's so interesting, Eddie, because I think that I didn't know what philosophy was, but I think that I was always kind of interested in these kind of questions. I remember early when I was a child, just thinking about the numbers and bugging my mom with the question, so what number is the highest? And she said they just keep going. I think at one point she said it was 88 or something. I have this memory, looking up at my mom, what number is the highest? And I feel like she said it was like 88. And then I was like, there's no number higher than 88, you know? And I was like, well, no, there is one more. Like, well, what's 88 plus one, right? It's just like, oh, they keep going, they keep going. And I was just like very fascinated by that. Like, how high do they go? And then if they go up forever, that's weird. You know, how can there be an infinite number of numbers, you know?
Right.
So I remember kind of having those questions and thinking about sort of big questions about what kind of a world I'm in. But I didn't know that there was this thing called philosophy. That field of philosophy was completely unknown to me.
Wow.
Not until high school, and then I discovered it sort of on the internet that people were kind of doing this professionally, thinking about these questions.
Yeah, that's that seems like one of those arbitrary answers that parents give to their kids, kind of like I do. Just stop the questions. It's
I might be misremembering. I just have this vague memory of that, you know. But yeah, I know what you mean. You have to say something. Maybe that was like the biggest number, you know, at the time, right? That I had considered, right? Um, but then I went to my dad. You know, after I talked with my mom about this, I continue to have these conversations with my dad, and it seemed like he was more interested than my mom in kind of uh, kind of thinking with me about my questions, and so I appreciated that.
that's that's funny because in my experience, it seems like the dads tend to be a bit more nihilistic about everything. It's, it all ends. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
It's, but I do have memories of when I was a child.
Mhm.
I would lay in bed. I'm talking before teenage years, and wonder about space and
Mhm.
what's out there.
Yeah,
And
right.
is there something beyond space? And sometimes it would actually kind of frighten me. Um, so it's, I guess I kind of had a philosophical mind when I was young, but I would have never thought I would have ended up as philosophy as a hobby, though,
Mhm.
just given my background. Because, like you said, I mean, went through the deconstruction and everything and kind of stumbled in to philosophy. Um, so when you got ready to go to college, what were you thinking you
Mhm.
wanted to do at that time? Was it philosophy?
So I was actually a computer programmer. When I was 12 years old, we got this little green, it was like black and green computer. So the text was like green. There was no color. And I got very interested in like programming it to make like text-based adventures. And then as I got older, we got a color computer, and I was interested in making games, and then eventually 3D games. And so this was actually my passion in high school and then in college. So I ended up getting a degree in computer science. But kind of like you, I picked up the philosophy hobby. And once I discovered what this was, I remember coming into one of my classes and I had checked out several books on the existence of God, some by atheists arguing against God, some by theists arguing for God. I still remember sitting next to a football player who played for ASU, Arizona State, and he was like, "So, what are you doing? What are those books?" And I was like, "Well, I'm trying to sort of figure out the nature of reality." So I think this is like freshman or sophomore year of college. I was getting a degree in computer programming, but I was definitely interested in philosophy sort of on the side as a hobby.
So did you have were there any particular philosophers that inspired you or
Mm-hmm.
that you really looked up to at that time?
Yes. At that time, I discovered William Rowe, and he's got this book on the cosmological argument. And it's interesting because I think most people who know William Rowe might think of him as an atheist philosopher arguing against God from evil, because he became very well known for his articulations of the problem of evil. But the book that I read from his was The Cosmological Argument, and he critiques certain versions of it, but then toward the end of the book, he finds a pathway that he says can provide, he says it's not a proof, but it can provide a kind of reasonable belief in not just a necessary eternal foundation of things, but a foundation that would have divine attributes of perfection. And he makes that
Mm,
argument toward the end there, and he analyzes that. He doesn't come to a belief in God himself on the basis of the argument, but he assesses the argument as being a reason that one could have to believe in God. I thought that was very interesting. So he was somebody early on. Let's see, Norman Geisler. I discovered his work. His was kind of one of my earliest discoveries, and he has a very systematic approach, which I found very interesting and helpful, organizing the different topics. Then later I discovered other philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and Wes Morriston was another philosopher I discovered as an undergrad. In fact, I remember emailing Wes Morriston some questions I had about his online lectures that I discovered on the internet. And he replied. And so we had an interesting conversation. And then when I got into graduate school, I ended up TAing for Wes as a graduate student. So I thought that was kind of fun and cool how that worked out.
That's interesting because I have a couple friends who have sent emails to you, and you respond quite often to it. And I think that's pretty awesome, given all the work that you have to do, that you still take the time to respond to the lay people or the ones just getting started in it. So
thank you. I enjoy that. Yeah.
Yeah,
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and sometimes they're like, "Oh, we'd have a question or something." Well, why don't you just email Josh? And I'm like, Josh has got so much to do. The last thing I want to do is just bombard him with emails. So I make them do it.
Well, I am getting slightly overrun by it, but it's still very enjoyable. What I do is I batch them. And so if somebody emails me and I don't reply for a while, what I'm doing is I'm sort of batching a bunch together, and then I'll sort of knock them out. And I'm also trying to sort of send answers into my new website, Worldview Design, where I'll do a sort of weekly answer to a question there as well.
Yeah, that's a fantastic. That's a fantastic site that you have. I'm a member there too, and the amount of people giving. I think every day I have another email for an article, and it's just it's so much information at the fingertips. I think it's a super awesome thing that you did with it. So it makes sense now, as much as you think about reality, the nature of reality, the foundation of reality, that you are a programmer, because most programmers or code writers or firmware technicians, and they kind of, if they're theistic, they have a Spinoza kind of idea about God, or they're pantheist or something like that. It seems like you guys almost kind of look at life being code. Is that?
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought about it that way. I'm sure it's pretty diverse in terms of what the programmers would think, but I can see what you mean, sort of that informational element of code. I mean, one thing that I noticed when I would do software development is that sometimes the program wouldn't do what I wanted it to do. And I discovered that there was always a reason for that. Like, it was never just random. And maybe I couldn't figure out what the bug was in the program right away. But really, through process of trial and error, I would discover, oh, okay, here's the bit of code that's causing this effect that I don't like, and then I would change that code and get a different effect. And so there's a real causal order. And I've thought about that in terms of the sort of intelligibility of reality. Reality is intelligible in ways. It makes sense. Like, there's a causal order, and it makes sense even beyond like what I know. So even if I don't understand how it works, there's some way it works. And if I investigate it, I can sort of figure that out. And then also the informational element, that in order to get the program to do anything that I want, it takes a lot of thinking through in order to produce interesting effects. So there might be, that sort of connection between the programmer and the sort of philosophical view.
Yeah, that's because to me, looking at how mathematics works, in reality, it's almost like we can explain everything through some kind of mathematical formula, or, we find things in physics before we actually really find them. It
Mm-hmm.
seems like there's kind of a coded language,
Yeah.
that lies behind everything. So,
Yeah.
so I've noticed a few of the comments and things that you've been putting lately more about consciousness. It's, are you an
Mm-hmm.
idealist?
That's a difficult and interesting question for me. Difficult in part because the term idealism comes in different varieties, as well as it has certain associations that I used to associate it with that I don't subscribe to. But it's been interesting because
Oh, froze on us. I guess the internet coding gods cursed him. So we will have to see if he can pop back in or
for
not.
me,
Ah, there we go. Okay,
did
now
I
you're
just
back.
cut out?
Yeah, you froze for a minute, and
Okay.
I was fixing to start panicking, but
I,
yeah.
I
So
was here all along. I was moving the whole time, but I get it.
it was
The
you
image of
left.
me.
Yeah, you left off at different ideas of idealism, some you
Yeah.
didn't ascribe to.
Yeah, so I've been on a journey, a slow journey, step by step, to seeing the world as not just fundamentally mental, but that we can explain the pieces of reality, the laws of physics, the geometric structures that we see in terms of the things that are most familiar to us within consciousness. So within my own consciousness, I witness informational structures, which I could call thoughts. And these can be the basis of intentions. So intentions, well, let me put this a little bit differently. An intention to, let's say, go mow the lawn, that intention builds within it an informational component or a thought component that I will mow the lawn. And these intentions then can be the basis of laws, where laws come out of this sort of informational structure that we witness it within our own consciousness. Same thing with visual imagery. I've had dreams where I knew I was dreaming, and I was wondering, okay, well, what if I'm dreaming? Like, what is this stuff that I'm looking at? I'm looking at geometric patterns and colors and shapes, and I'm thinking, well, what is that? I mean, some people say that it's nothing. You're not aware of anything. But if I'm not aware of anything, how can I distinguish one part of my dream from another? I mean, if it's just nothingness, how can I distinguish one nothing from another nothing? Nothing.
And he froze on us again. You got to love the California internet. We'll wait here a second. I'm sure he'll pop back on here. So while we wait for him to pop back up, we'll look at a few comments. Hmm.
Is anybody on the computer? No.
Ah, it was Converse Contender's fault. Okay, there you go.
But yeah. So everybody's off the computers on my end. So
Okay.
hopefully this can continue. Um,
That's okay.
yeah.
We don't have any power over the internet. We just kind of move with what we have. So the dreams distinguishing nothingness from,
From
or what
other,
people say.
yeah. So I mean, I would have dreams where I would see shapes and colors or something like that. And if somebody says, "Well, I'm not actually seeing anything, or not acquainted with anything, not aware of anything," the problem with I have with that is that I can distinguish parts of my dream. I can see that, okay, here's some kind of like red patch over here. Here's now I'm shifting my attention, or somehow my dream is changing up. Now it's like a blue patch, or geometry changes. And there's different analyses of that, but minimally it looks like I'm acquainted with something. And what's been intriguing to me is both on the science end and the philosophy end, there's a lot of interesting science that points to this, and then there's interesting conceptual analysis that's very interesting to me, and has been leading me along the lines of analyzing the world in terms of the things that are most familiar to us, the contents of our own consciousness, so that we have thoughts, feelings, emotions, intentions, uh, geometric imagery within visual images, and that if we can analyze reality in terms of those things, then we can give a parsimonious account of reality. There's different ways we can develop this. That's why I said there's different versions of idealism. And I actually hesitate to use the term idealism. I'm more comfortable with saying something like mentality is primary or fundamental to reality. So it's sort of like the upside down picture of materialism, where on materialism, reality is fundamentally mindless. And then from mindless units, you generate all mentality. I think that picture is precisely upside down of what I think is true, which is that it's mind that's fundamental and everything else comes from that, from mentality.
You know, the further along I get, and the more that I look into philosophy of mind and qualia, and just experience, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm leaning a lot more towards the same kind of idea that there's just something fundamental that seems to be, like a mind. Um,
Mm-hmm.
it's hard to imagine how, material can give rise to this enormous amount of content, that we can't measure like we can material things. And so, what is your idea of like abstracts? I mean, do they have a certain kind of existence to you, or how do you kind of categorize
Mm-hmm.
um, those abstracts? The kind of universal abstracts, the mental
Mm-hmm.
content that you're talking about.
Yeah, like numbers, for example, or propositions. So, for example, if I say snow is white over here, you know what I mean over there. Okay. Well, how are you able to know what I mean over there when I'm saying snow is white over here?
Uh,
So philosophers talk about a shared content between sentences. And well, what is that shared content? Call that a proposition. And propositions are things that can be true or false, can match reality. Snow is white, I think, matches with reality. But I can entertain the proposition that snow is white, even if there is no snow, even if nothing's white. So the proposition that snow is white, it's not the same thing as the sort of reality of snow being white. It's something else. And we could call it an abstract thing. I mean, I'm happy to just call it, a proposition or whatever. I think part of the problem with the term abstract is that even that term admits of different definitions. Some people define it as something that doesn't have causal powers, if it's abstract. But I don't know. Maybe propositions do have causal powers in some sense, or at least explanatory powers. They can serve as reasons for actions, for example. So
yeah, that's good. Yeah,
yeah,
it's I've been doing a lot more focusing kind of like on mereology and
parts and
mereological,
wholes. Yeah.
yeah, and mereological nihilism,
Mm-hmm.
and these different ideas of how reality kind of fits together. I don't
Yeah.
understand how somebody could be a mereological nihilist and not be an idealist in some kind of way. Um, I've had them explain to me, at the fundamental level, uh, these particles and things or points
Mm-hmm.
exist, and that's just what's fundamental. But it's kind of like the old PSR problem, where you just kind of follow the PSR to a certain point, and then it's just brute.
Uh-huh.
That's
The Brute
and
Facts
brute
podcast.
facts. That's
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I really want to join you here in the what you just said, because it's so fascinating. When I was in graduate school, there was a professor who gave a talk at Notre Dame about mereological nihilism, the view that uh, that everything is basically simples. arranged in different ways. So chairs are fundamentally like particles arranged like a chair. And then, but he argued from nihilism to the non-existence of people, right? Because the idea was that, well, I mean, if I exist, then from a materialistic perspective, the kind of thing that I would be some kind of complex structure, maybe a brain or something like this. But the nihilist doesn't think that there are any complex things. There's nothing that has parts. There's only the simples, right? But it's interesting, Eddie, because you just basically flipped that argument around. So you basically saw that, well, wait a minute. If anything's clear, it's that I exist. Okay, that's clear. Well, then, if mereological nihilism is true, well, then it follows that, well, I'm not a complex thing. I'm a simple, I'm one of the simples. I'm one of the basic beads of reality, right? And and I don't know that leads exactly to idealism, because you could still have simple persons and then
Yeah.
simple non-persons, right?
Right.
But I mean, why posit the extra complexity, right? If you already have simple persons, and then if you can explain everything else, all of your experiences of other things in terms of conscious states of persons, then there you go.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it also kind of fits into, like the philosophy of mind, the principle of parsimony. To
Mm-hmm.
me, it seems to be more parsimonious if the mental is fundamental instead of adding the material required for the mental. It seems like we're adding more, trying to come up with this idea of emergence or how, we can have the mental that exists. And it just seems like for the principle of parsimony that the mental would be the foundational thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was just going to say, just for the listeners, I'm not actually a mereological nihilist myself.
Yeah.
So just I
Yeah.
don't want to give the wrong idea. Although I can really appreciate the arguments for that. I mean, there's some very interesting puzzles. And there's certainly a connection from nihilism to what we're talking about here about consciousness, which also just shows how all these different topics are interrelated in deep ways.
Right.
And it's hard to really think about one without unpacking a lot of others. So you just mentioned parsimony. Well, why is parsimony relevant here? Well, because you might think that if you're going to compare two large scale theories of the world, and both of them account for all of the data that we're aware of, then the one that's the simplest, the one that posits the fewest kinds of things, you might think is more likely, other things being equal. So this is where parsimony comes in, right? And so then, if you can have a parsimonious theory with mentality being fundamental, and people make this argument, then maybe that would be, a reason in support of fundamental mentality. I think it's difficult though, because it's all going to depend on sort of what your primitives are. So
Mhm.
for some philosophers, I mean, it is sort of among their primitives. I was talking with the philosopher who said it's one of their primitives. The term natural is among their conceptual primitives, and that there are natural objects is something that they would take to be kind of part of their worldview. And so if that's right, then then there's a further question about whether natural objects could be fundamentally mental. But if you think that natural objects are fundamentally sort of at their base non-mental or mindless, then you're going to be working with different materials. And so then you still want the simplest theory that can account for all the materials that you're working with. But the simplest theory might not be the same as the theory that you're going to arrive at if you start with sort of mentality as your primitives.
Yeah, and it's also a fair critique, that just because it's parsimonious doesn't mean that it's true. It's just kind of a principle. It seems to be no reason to just, posit more complexity, even though some situations it is a more complex thing, especially when
Yeah,
we're talking
right.
about the mind. So,
Yeah. Be
so
like a
how
point in
does
its favor. Yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say,
Yeah.
so how does this all, your idea of reality, the way that you kind of view the fundamental nature, how does that tie into Christianity?
So a broadly Christian worldview is going to include the idea that reality is fundamentally mental, that there is a supreme mind, in fact, and that this mind is interested in us. The way that I would think about this is that a supreme mind would have supreme qualities, including the quality of being good and valuing that which is good. And so I take it that persons have a kind of intrinsic value. And so if that's right, then if there's a supreme mind, then the supreme mind would value persons, would value us. So it wouldn't be just entirely disinterested in our lives. And so at the heart of the Christian story is the idea that this supreme mind or universal fundamental being is so interested in us that it would enter into the human story and display for us its nature, and even identify with our suffering. I was actually thinking about this earlier today, the idea of sin, or let's say of shame, where you feel that sort of guilt because you've done something that you yourself, goes against your own conscience. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? I mean, every human being, I think, has that experience of, what do you do when you feel like you've failed? What do you do with that? And well, in the Christian story, what you have is God displaying forgiveness through that metaphor of that scapegoat, where the actual sins are put on God himself, put on Jesus. And then Jesus takes that. It's a reflection of the Old Testament metaphor of the sin going on the animals and then being sent off as a scapegoat. So it's like God saying, you know what? I know that you have that feeling of guilt and shame, and I love you, and I forgive that. Like, I'm offering you a clean slate. So all of this is related to whether there even is a foundational mind that could even care about us, right?
Right.
And so that's one of the deep connections here between thinking about consciousness and its ultimate nature and its ultimate basis, and these other worldview questions, I think, that are very practically connected to our lives in terms of whether God loves us, for example.
Did philosophy kind of lead you to the truth of Christianity, or was it a convincing or strengthening factor, and you were already, more or less a Christian? What was it that kind of led you to be confident in Christianity?
So this is kind of how I would tend to think about it in terms of philosophy, is that philosophy kind of helps me to look at the kind of the biggest questions and seek the deepest explanations. You mentioned abstract objects, like, what are these? Well, if we can analyze abstracta in terms of as elements that are based on concepts or thoughts or mind, then this is going to point to, again, a reason to think that reality has some kind of mentality. And so that this will then provide a kind of mutually supporting idea. If at the heart of human history, there is this account of God coming into human history and demonstrating love and purpose. And so I would think of philosophy as kind of providing, let's say, reinforcement for that idea. But I don't see that, like, just from philosophy you can sort of figure out these historical questions, right? So I think you kind of have to actually look into the historical data. I think the way that philosophy kind of helps me is that it gives me, it affects my prior probability of what to expect when I'm looking into the historical data. Because again, I mean, if I have reasons to think that instead reality is fundamentally mindless, then that's going to make any particular account of a mind entering into the world or displaying itself in some way obviously less likely. But if I have independent reasons for fundamental mind, then that's going to change the probability. But I don't think you can just answer the questions just philosophically. I think then you've got to actually look at the data of history. And that's something that I've done. And when I was at Notre Dame, I went to the library and checked out about a dozen or so books on this topic, reading the critical scholars, looking at the historical data. This is not my area of expertise. So when I speak about this, I don't speak as an expert, but it is something that I obviously would be interested in and have studied. My sort of expertise is more in the sort of foundations of reality, sort of thinking about that. And then I sort of bring that into my analysis of the history. That's kind of how I tend to think about it.
Interesting. That's I think you brought up a very interesting point there, and that is how we view the fundamental nature of reality. Um, I I guess if one uh, believes that it is material at the foundation, that kind of minimizes, the ability to view, a cosmic mind or some kind of mind
Mm-hmm.
behind nature or reality. So that's a very interesting point that I've really never considered.
Yeah, well, and it affects your prior probability. So
Right.
your prior probability is sort of your expectation of how likely a hypothesis prior to the the evidence that you're going to consider, like the historical evidence, for example. The prior probability of a square circle raising Jesus from the dead, okay, is like
Yeah.
in my mind 0, right? Because I have independent reason to think there can't be a square circle. Now, for some people, some people might be watching this and they might have certain arguments against the coherence of a supreme mind. And then those arguments will diminish the prior probability for them prior to even looking at any kind of evidence with respect to the historicity of God entering into the world. And I also want to just say this. Something else that philosophy has done for me is it's kind of widened my conception of God's relationship to beings and cultures throughout history and throughout time. That I mentioned that my worldview fell apart, and then when I was in high school, and then I began to investigate things. And it's not that as I investigated things, like every element of my original worldview just was restored or something like this. I mean, I remember having this moment of thinking, I can't just make up reality. And so if I really want to find out reality, I have to like face it bravely and go into it and just seek the truth, right? And that process, and people will arrive at different truths and different ideas, I think, depending on their journey. But for me, it didn't lead me to pick up all the original pieces. It led me to see God as bigger and more universal than I had imagined. It restored certain pieces, but certain other pieces I came to think were too simple, actually. So, I mean, I've come to think that God moves in different contexts and different cultures. And I don't think that every way is equally right or equally good. I think that loving people is a way that's better than hating people, no matter which religion or which culture you come from.
All right.
Love is better than hate, right? But that God sees people on their journey, even in different contexts and different cultures. And to be honest, I see that there are truths in different contexts and different cultures that aren't emphasized so much in some cultures. And so I really do think that different cultures can help each other see new angles and new sides of God. Even maybe better understanding one's own tradition. You can sort of see one's own tradition in new light by entering into another tradition, another perspective.
Yeah, well, you're talking about prior probability, so you're right,
Yeah.
right up my. I'm a Bayesian guy, so you're right up my alley with that. But um, I would agree 100%. My view of God and the world was extremely narrow
Mm-hmm.
before going through kind of a deconstruction and reconstruction, and I have a much different idea of God, a more full, robust, and wider range.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's trying to understand, this in science terms. Let's say 10 dimensional creature. When we're
Mm-hmm.
three-dimensional creatures, we're not going to fully grasp everything about it. But at the same time, just the overarching relation to reality that I never had before. I never would have thought anything like, panentheism or soft panentheism or divine conceptualism or any of these ideas where Aquinas is, immanence, that God actually permeated reality in the way that he does, regardless of one's idea of that. So I'm with you 100% on that. It has just broadened my idea of God. And speaking of different cultures and things, I also know that you're a universalist. How did you get to universalism? Oh, I think he froze up again. I hope I didn't say all that for nothing. I'm hoping that possibly. Oh, he disconnected this time. Man, that's okay. We're going to get through it. He'll pop back in. And so for the chat, I do apologize, but I am very ADHD and I have to really focus on my guest. I can't do the chat and at the same time, I'm not that good. So we'll go through here and look at a few of these and see if Josh can pop back on. Let's see. Secular Rarity says he knew he didn't exist. Sure. Grand Priest is called mereological nihilism crazy. He seems to find it self-evident that he is a whole that has parts. I don't disagree. Oh, wow. I'm going to have to talk to Dustin about that.
I'm not.
There we go.
Sure what's going on here with my internet. I'm so sorry about that.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about it. It's a live show. It happens. I can go back and edit it later on. So,
Okay.
So I was asking, we were talking about culture, you were talking about cultures and things. And I also know that you're a universalist. What made you come to the idea of universalism? Because I want to be sold on the idea of universalism.
Yeah. Okay. So for the audience, I want to make sure it's clear. Universal reconciliation is not the same as pluralism. So sometimes these get conflated.
Right.
So pluralism is the idea that kind of roughly all paths are paths to God, all paths through all the major religions, and there's different ways of characterizing pluralism. Whereas universalism, universal reconciliation, is the idea that everybody has a bright future in the sense that, salvation does come through grace and repentance, and we all need God. Nobody saves themselves. There's a cooperation with God's grace. Nobody's perfect, so we all need that restoration. But that through a process, everybody will eventually come through. And also, this is not a no-hell position either. So it's not the idea that nobody is ever separated from God, but rather that that separation doesn't have to continue in eternal conscious torment or even annihilation.
Yeah.
And so this is a view that I always thought was a view that maybe people who liked philosophy might like this view, not for biblical reasons, but purely because they would think that if God's perfectly loving, then universalism has to be true. That was the impression that I had. And so for me, that impression was completely shattered as I began to investigate the biblical data on this topic. It started with an article by Yale philosopher Keith DeRose, Universalism and the Bible. And Keith DeRose makes an argument from the biblical data for why he thinks that the best interpretation points toward a kind of universal reconciliation through Christ. So it's not a pluralism. It's still through a road, through a doorway. But he makes the argument from the biblical data that all people will eventually come through that road. And I have to say, I wasn't just like convinced by the article, but what it did convince me of was that it was possible for somebody to believe that the biblical data pointed toward universal reconciliation. And I didn't even know that, because that kind of shattered the idea that sort of on a psychological level, nobody taking the biblical data seriously would arrive at that position. And that kind of sparked, I would say, like a 10-year journey of me thinking about it, considering the passages, turning over the issues in my mind. And the result of that journey has been a shift in my understanding that, my wife and I, we wrote this little book, When Heaven Invades Hell, where we display some of our thinking about the topic in the form of a dialogue debate. It's in a fictional context, but it's a way of sort of displaying the arguments in this context so that readers could explore those arguments and see maybe that there's a little more depth than what is often appreciated, at least more depth than I ever knew was there.
Wow. Yeah, you beat me to it. I was going to say you and your wife had written a book about it. It's I guess kind of like a C.S. Lewis style, where there's a theological message and implication to fictional story. So it's it's pretty cool. It gives you a different way of understanding it. I think that eternal conscious torment is just, I don't think it's biblical. I don't think it's viable. I don't think it's any sense of the word good God could be sustaining people in eternity, for punishment. I, quote unquote, am a hopeful universalist.
Okay.
And the more that I study Second Temple Judaism, in Judaism, like the Hasidic Jews or Orthodox or ultra-Orthodox, had this idea of Sheol, that there's 11 years maximum where you're in this place. So the way that I heard one rabbi explain it was, here on earth with the fallen nature of humanity, our soul has this stench, and it's the stench of fallenness. And depending on, the level of fallenness or the evils that we do, it depends on how long it takes in Sheol for this stench to be removed, from our soul. So this idea, kind of like a purgatory kind of thing. And those who are not considered Abrahamic or faithful Abrahamic are annihilated. So it's not this universal reconciliation to me is not totally foreign to the Abrahamic faiths. And one important thing you'd mentioned about Christ being the way, that is one of the things that that I've struggled to, speaking with other evangelicals, that the Bible teaches that Christ is the way. The Bible doesn't teach that you have to know Christ. You have to, for all of those who don't get the opportunity to hear the gospel or things like that, it just says that God is the way. And I think we add all of these different things in this litmus test of certain beliefs and positions and things like that. And I think that I take the Bible, at its word, that Christ is the way, regardless of how we're saved. It is through Christ, so that's kind of the way that I take it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because Keith DeRose, he even makes the point that, even if you need certain beliefs to have the proper content, there's time for that. And it doesn't have to be sort of on this side. It could be in a near-death experience or in another way, post-mortem. There's different models for that. And I actually think that that's kind of what I care about. And I don't want to necessarily say the most here, but I find very helpful to just kind of get different models on the table, because I think models can be very liberating. I think sometimes if you get stuck in one model, okay, then it's like everything hangs on that one model. you mentioned being a hopeful universalist. Well, that suggests that you're not just like committed to the universal reconciliation idea, but it's a model that's a live option for you. And it was very interesting because in I think it was Greg Boyd's book, Letters to a Skeptic. This is a book where it grew out of letters to his dad, who was an atheist, did not believe in God, and they were talking about theology, and Greg basically was moving through the different objections that his dad was having. And by the end of the book, his dad changes his mind and comes to believe in God, becomes a Christian. But one of the obstacles toward the end was that question of hell and eternal conscious torment. And what Greg did, I thought was very interesting, was he presented some different models, including a model that Greg himself didn't accept, but he didn't want there to be an unnecessary barrier because the core truths that Greg was trying to point to didn't require his particular model. And so he pointed to some different ones. I think annihilation was one of them. And so his dad, in the next chapter, his dad kind of grabbed onto one of the models that Greg himself wasn't personally endorsing, but it's one of the options. And he said, okay, well, if scholars can debate this, then I don't need to sort of be hung up on this. And I thought that was very interesting because it shows how I think sometimes there can be unnecessary barriers to a certain treasure, something that is a valuable truth, but it's associated with certain models, but it's not essentially connected to those models. And by seeing a range of models, you can avoid, even if you don't have a view on which of those models is right, it can keep you from distractions, keep you from barriers, really, to, let's say, more important truths.
Right. Yeah, and that's kind of one of the things that philosophy has done for me, is kind of unlocked my mind from this black and white view,
Mm-hmm.
that I have to take a certain view or put a label on my view, or it's helped me to try to stay intellectually humble.
Mm-hmm.
It's because I have been wrong many a times.
Yeah, humble and
And
curious, willing to be wrong. Yeah,
right,
exploring,
it's
growing.
it's kind of like you defended the correspondence theory of truth, and I'm kind of like, why can't we just take some from coherentism or in correspondence, and kind of build this meta view?
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I would agree with you. I think that correspondence is far more
Well,
accurate
you're
of.
speaking again to the value of models, right? I mean, they're different
Right.
models of truth, and you can sort of become flexible in your thinking by seeing how the different models could explain certain data. And I think that's very helpful. And I also want just to point out here, if I could,
Hmm.
that sometimes I think what will keep somebody from considering another model is that the current model that they have already seems so clear that you almost like can't imagine how somebody could think another way. And I kind of had this thought about the universal reconciliation versus eternal conscious torment and annihilation views, is that I thought, well, the biblical data is just very clear. It says literally that the smoke of their torment will go up forever and ever. Like, how could it not be clearer, right?
Right.
So, I mean, this is part of why I had this sort of psychological analysis that the only people who could have a different view just couldn't be reading the clear passages of scripture, right? But then I began to do the word studies and I discovered, oh, that word anionios, it shows up in the Greek Septuagint translation of Jonah when it describes his time in the fish being forever. But wait a minute, in the same text, it says he got out. Like he wasn't literally in there for everlasting, for eternity. He actually got out of the fish, right? In that very text, and it's the
Right.
exact same word. Um, and yeah, and there's other places in that time, that culture, where it uses that word to express a time or a period, And then people say, well, what about when it says that some will go to eternal life and others to eternal death? We need to be symmetrical there. It's clear that if heaven goes on endlessly, that death must go on endlessly. This is the argument from parallel. But then
Hmm.
you look at that and you say, but wait a minute. I mean, if that term literally does mean ages, then you can translate it as some go on for ages to life and some go on for ages to death, and it leaves it unspecified parallelly in both cases. Does that mean that we have no way of anticipating that eternal life is endless? Well, no, because there's other data from Scripture talking about being clothed with immortal bodies, and also there's an argument from God's love. And so there's other reasons for thinking that life can go on forever, that the good and the bad are asymmetric. So those are just a few examples. And I mean, I'm getting kind of passionate about this just because I feel like there can be barriers. My goal here is not to argue for universal reconciliation. That's not my point, but it's just to kind of open it up a little bit, and maybe remove some barriers that would prevent people from even considering the possibility.
And you bring up a very good point, because when I have discussions with, literalists, a lot of times I have to explain the concept of being lost in translation, cultural context, things like this. We have, you can't always translate a word exactly into the English language, or they would use a word that had a lot of different meanings, and we have to kind of understand that we're, thousands of years removed from this culture and this language, and we're still learning about the culture and the language, and we have to put that into perspective. But I think
point. Yeah. If I could just add here, I mean, it's not that the text can't be clear. It's just that sometimes, and I'm speaking for myself now, something might seem clear because of the English translation and maybe the sermons that surrounded that English translation from my youth. So it just seems clear, right? It's sort of like that feeling that nobody speaks with an accent. That other people speak with an accent, but you yourself don't speak with an accent because you don't recognize your own accent.
Right.
Similarly, it's like you are maybe raised in a tradition, you read it in your own language, and so one interpretation might seem clear relative to your own language in that tradition, but then you dig in, you realize, just like you said, that it's translated across culture and across language, and sometimes there's variations there that we wouldn't know just by reading it in our English translations.
Right. So now it's time for the hard questions.
Okay. It gets harder now.
Yeah. What is your favorite band?
Uh-oh. That is a hard question. Oh, goodness. I like the music that my wife makes. So she composes music. Yeah, so she's not exactly a band, but I mean, she's made music where she's recorded all the different parts. She would do each instrument one at a time and then put them all together into a track.
Wow.
So she's probably at the top of my list.
Okay, she's not listening. Who's your real band?
No, I don't really have a good answer to this, right? So I like when I do my writing, I kind of like to have sort of like some techno music that I can listen to. It has a certain energy to it.
Oh yeah,
I like Evanescence, for example. But
oh wow, yeah, Evanescence rocks. I like Evanescence. I don't remember the guy's name. He was from the band 12 Stones, which was actually a Christian rock band. That does some of the lead or helps with the vocals in some of the more famous songs that they did. But does pineapple go on pizza?
No.
Yes. I already like
That's
you.
The right
I love
answer.
You now. Yes.
But tomatoes.
Right. I can do a what do they call that? The tomato and basil margarita pizza. Oh yeah, I can definitely do that. Well, tomatoes are a fruit, aren't they?
You can have tomatoes, and you can mix it up with banana peppers. Give you a little bit of spice.
I do like some banana peppers.
Yeah.
What's your favorite dessert?
Mint chocolate chip ice cream Breyers.
Wow, that was very specific. Is that one of those I got to have a bowl before I go to bed every night ice cream?
Not every night, no. And actually, I've discovered you can have frozen fruit and you mash it up, and that tastes just as good, healthier. So
wow,
that works as well.
Welcome to Brute Facts and Diet Pointers. Well, Dr. Josh, I tried to keep it around an hour. I am extremely thankful that you came on and spoke with us, and I think you had some very interesting points and very interesting life. I love your work, and I think you're a fantastic person, and I really appreciate it.
I appreciate that, Eddie. And if I may just ask you a hard question, the hardest
Uh-oh.
question you've ever been asked live, putting you on the spot.
Oh,
Why Brute Facts podcast?
why brute facts?
There
Okay.
must be an explanation, right, for the name Brute Facts.
Yes. So, being a theist, being interested in uh, the modal contingency argument, modal logic, and it seemed that the alternative to the principle of sufficient reason, or it always ended at brute fact or brute contingency or
Mm-hmm.
brute something. So,
Mm-hmm.
I was like, how funny, or they always want to say, well, God is a brute fact. Um, so I was like, how neat would that be? Or kind of flipping it around that a theist or a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
had a brute fact program. And so I checked it on YouTube and it wasn't taken. And I checked the website and it wasn't taken. I said, well, then that's it. It's a brute fact.
I
So
love it. Love it. Well, it's
yeah,
satisfying to hear that there was an explanation for
yeah,
picking of the
yeah.
name. It's not just a brute fact. That's
Yeah.
called Brute Facts.
I see what you did there. That's pretty good.
So thank you for that.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Josh. I'm going to see everybody out of here and put you in the back room. If you got to go, that's fine. If not, I'll be there in a minute.
Thank you. Catch you later.
Oh, actually, before I let you go, anything you want to plug before you go? Aren't you working on a new book?
Working on a book on consciousness, and I would say what we mentioned earlier, the worldview-design.com is a resource to encourage people in their thinking about the hardest questions. The hardest questions about God and reality. So the questions that I like to think about.
There's some good content there too. And I do have his website in the description. You can find his books there. And it's a cool website.
And there's free resources there that you can get off of the website. Yeah, articles and things there. So, yep.
So thank you very much. I'll see you in a minute.
Thank you.
Dr. Josh Rasmussen, man, that's I was trying everything I could not to fanboy. I love Dr. Josh. I love his work. I love the way his mind works. He has been an incredible influence in my philosophical journey. I cite his stuff quite often, and I'm sure there's plenty of people here who's heard me cite his work. But anyway, thank you everybody for coming. I really appreciate it. I have had a great time talking with Dr. Josh, and I think I don't have the date offhand, but Russ Schaefer Landau's coming on, and I have a couple of other philosophers in the works, and I will put that information out as soon as we get dates that are nailed down. Thanks again, everybody.